Yeah, that was. It suddenly felt so wrong coming out of my mouth. So, am I just being South London, or was that right? My name's Mariam, and the story I'm about to tell you is about the Egyptian Revolution and how politics divided my family. My parents moved from Egypt in their 20s. It was around the 1970s. Egypt was a newly independent country, and the economy was in tatters, and prospects were pretty low for them. As immigrants, and particularly as Copts, my parents had a very particular form of patriotism. It's common that when you move away from your homeland, you feel even more attached to where you came from. Egypt was this magical, incredible land. There was just deep nostalgia for this special place that they wanted us to be connected to as well. After university, I went for the first time on my own to the south of Egypt. This was rural Egypt, where there's high levels of extreme poverty. It was a side to Egypt that I'd never seen before. I began to really see more and more what social injustice looked like. It was a continued kind of unravelling of what I knew to be the norm of life. There were a lot of questions that began to arise in me of reality. Why was this happening, and where was God in the middle of it?
Some significant breaking news in Egypt at this hour. The office of the presidency there has just announced that President Hosni Mubarak has stepped down. That was a demand for weeks now from anti-government protesters.
In 2011, what had become known as the Arab Spring kicked off. My sister was living in Egypt at the time. We had our whole family in Egypt at the time, aunts, uncles, cousins. Quite quickly it became clear that me and my parents were at polar opposites of where we stood on the good nature of this particular revolution. The way that my parents saw it was that safety and security and stability for the country was number one. For me though, I'd come to understand that the levels of frustration and the levels of anger and the levels of really just being done with the current status quo was also what led people to those streets. I think one of the hardest things in us being on polar opposites was that what they saw was my position was that I also didn't put my family right at the heart of that I perhaps didn't care as much about their safety and security and their future, which just wasn't true. And the tension in the house was tangible. It was impossible to have discussions where we could see each other's perspectives because we just came from opposite ends of views, but also everybody was charged emotionally. So often it would just go into silence. And it wasn't a silence that was trying to appease or trying to fix the conflict, but it was a silence that actually just became more distance. The whole night I was kind of grappling with these tensions that were living in me, but more than anything I could just see over and over again the faces of brokenness, of poverty, and I couldn't get rid of this feeling that they were coming to the surface. The next day I remember being on this particular hilltop in Cornwall, and it was a bit of a typical grey kind of cloudy day. And I stood on the top of this hilltop and everything was sort of sitting right at the top of my chest. And I just remember shouting into the clouds for the first time and just saying, God, where have you been in the midst of all of this? I think what's always surprising about God's still small voice is the fear that I carried for so long of asking those questions, the fire and brimstone that if we doubt will be struck down, was sort of living somewhere in the back of my head. And yet what I experienced on that hilltop and what I've experienced since, every time I've asked those questions, has been this incredible grace and mercy. And just knowing that those are the times where God is so present, where we finally lay it bare and say what's actually deep in our hearts. And it really was from that moment that I began to feel more comfortable in asking those big questions. So for me, from that point, things never change immediately, but it was certainly the beginning of a journey of learning to come to conversation and to come to difference with curiosity, and to be less afraid of those questions in those spaces. To know that if I was to walk in and have a difference of opinion, it doesn't have to end in a complete breaking of relationship, but there is something in between that we can grapple with. And so for me, it was learning to put aside my fears, to learn that God was in the midst of that, and to be able to actually come with questions into those spaces, particularly thinking of the differences that me and my mum might have politically or otherwise, to really come into those spaces and to ask questions to get to know her story better, to get to know where she's coming from. In the silence, we kept so much unsaid that it felt like the gap widened, and yet when we actually questioned each other and came into relationship with one another, it was actually just a case of coming closer to each other's humanity.